All right, sixth lecture for chapter 19 here in Unit 3. We're going to start talking about some of the various factors that affect your blood pressure. So this is going to be the most complex part of Unit 3 in terms of the physiology. Lots of stuff to learn here. All right, what affects your blood pressure? Three main things. And we've talked about quite a few of these things before, but now we're going to really be putting them together. One thing is your cardiac output. All right, so as we discussed earlier, the greater the volume of blood in your blood vessels, the more force that blood is going to be applying to the walls. That's your blood pressure. So it makes sense. The greater your blood volume, the greater your blood pressure. All right, so blood volume in general will increase your blood pressure. And we talked about that a little bit when we did the endocrine system. If you guys remember, both aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone help you increase your blood pressure by causing you to retain more water within the blood and your other body fluids as well. So anything that increases blood volume, the amount of plasma, is going to increase your blood pressure. That includes cardiac output. Cardiac output is the volume of blood that is pumped out of the heart, out of the left ventricle each minute. So if your cardio output goes up, blood pressure is going to go up. Peripheral resistance refers to the resistance to blood flow that exists within your blood vessels. So that's called your peripheral resistance, abbreviated as PR, and we'll be talking about that quite a bit here in this part of the class. One of the things that influences peripheral resistance, we've talked about before, vasoconstriction. If you have constriction, the smooth muscle in the tunica media of blood vessels is contracting. That constricts those blood vessels, and that increases resistance to blood flow. It makes it more difficult for the blood to flow through those blood vessels. All right, and what is that going to do to the pressure? It's going to increase or decrease it. If you're squeezing the walls of a blood vessel because they're contracting, well, what happens? Always say refer back to the garden hose analogy. If you squeeze the walls of a garden hose, the pressure goes up. Same thing with your blood pressure. If you have more constriction of the walls of blood vessels, your blood pressure is going to go up. So just start thinking about it. If any of these three things, if any of these increase, your blood pressure increases. If any of them decrease, your blood pressure will go down. Then we're going to be talking about the various things that control these. Now, cardiac output, you've already learned. I'm not going to go back through what increases and decreases your cardiac output. We covered that back in chapter 18, but that information is relevant here again as well. Okay, controlling your blood pressure, really critical part of homeostasis, and it involves the heart, because the heart is involved, of course, in cardiac output. It involves your blood vessels themselves, and whether or not they're constricting or dilating. Also, whether they're healthy. You know, you build up these fatty plaques within the walls of your blood vessels, and that's going to provide obstructions to blood flow as well. That's going to increase the resistance to blood flow. Finally, your kidneys. Your kidneys play a super, super important role in helping you maintain proper blood pressure homeostasis as well. And we'll also see the brain has structures in it that help supervise and control your blood pressure. All right, so three things are involved in blood pressure. One of those is cardiac output. And, you know, just a brief review, cardiac output is calculated as the stroke volume. That's the volume of blood that the left ventricle is ejecting into the aorta with each contraction, times your heart rate, the number of times your heart beats per minute, and that gives you a volume which in an average adult is about 5 to 5.5 liters per minute. And that 5 to 5.5 liters per minute is the amount of blood flow you have throughout your entire systemic circulation each minute. Cardiac output is controlled by the various factors we discussed in Unit 2 back in Chapter 18. So you want to review how the heart rate is controlled. Remember we talked about how the sympathetic nervous system influences heart rate, how the parasympathetic nervous system influences it, the roles of certain hormones and how they influence heart rate. And then also your stroke volume. We talked about how sympathetic nerve signals to the myocardium of the ventricles increases contractility, for example, makes those cardiac muscle fibers contract with more force. That's going to increase your stroke volume. That's going to increase your cardiac output. Other thing you need to keep in mind, if stroke volume goes up, if heart rate goes up, either of those two, your cardiac output goes up. Increased cardiac output means increased blood pressure, which means anything that increases your heart rate increases your blood pressure. Anything that increases your stroke volume will increase your blood pressure. So be sure to keep all of those things in mind as you're learning this blood pressure story. Okay, I'm not going to go through figure 19.8 here, but your textbook does have this diagram, which is reviewing the major factors that enhance your cardiac output, and that is a review from what we were talking about in Chapter 18. So if I were you, I would go back through this diagram and make sure you understand it, because anything that increases your cardiac output will increase your blood pressure. So any of these things that you see over here will wind up increasing it. All right, now peripheral resistance is a newer topic for us, so we will spend some more time talking about peripheral resistance here in Unit 3. So peripheral resistance, or PR, again, what that refers to is opposition to blood flow, anything that makes blood flow through your blood vessels more difficult. And technically what it is, it's a measurement of the amount of friction that blood encounters with blood vessel walls. So the more volume of blood that's actually contacting the walls of your blood vessels, that increases the amount of friction, that slows blood flow down. If you slow blood flow down, that's increasing resistance, and that winds up increasing your blood pressure. And an easier way to think about that is if the lumen in a blood vessel is decreased in size, PR goes up. If the lumen, that space in there, is wider, friction goes down, peripheral resistance to blood flow goes down, and that actually winds up decreasing your blood pressure. So just keep in mind that increased peripheral resistance increases your blood pressure. All right, so what are the sources of resistance? One is your blood viscosity. Thicker blood, what's that going to do? Is thicker blood going to flow more quickly or more slowly through your blood vessels? Hopefully you're thinking it's going to move more slowly. So that's increasing the resistance to flow. So that increases your peripheral resistance. And what does that do to your blood pressure? Increases your blood pressure. So if you think about, what could increase your blood viscosity? Well, what if you have polycythemia? Remember, if you have an excess production of red blood cells, that's going to thicken your blood because those red blood cells are taking up more space in your blood than they normally would. You're going to have a lower volume of plasma in there. That's going to increase your peripheral resistance, and it's going to increase your blood pressure. Now, I kind of caught myself, but I almost said dehydration, and that is true. When you're a little bit dehydrated, you've lost some body fluid, your blood does get thicker, and your blood pressure will go up a little bit, but that's kind of a temporary thing, and I think that can be kind of confusing to think about, because if you keep getting more and more and more dehydrated, your blood volume starts to go down so much that your blood pressure actually starts to drop as well, because blood volume, your overall blood volume, is another one of those major factors that influences your blood pressure. So you have to kind of be careful when you're thinking about dehydration and its impacts on your blood pressure. A little bit of dehydration increases blood pressure, but more serious dehydration will actually wind up lowering it because of the reduction of your blood volume. The total blood vessel length, the longer a blood vessel is, the more resistance you have to blood flow through that blood vessel. Blood can flow more quickly, more easily through a shorter vessel than through a longer vessel. Probably the easiest way to think about that, imagine if you had some water in a straw. Can you blow that water more quickly through a short straw or a long straw? Or does it require more force for you to blow the water through the long straw or the short straw? It's going to be the long straw. And that's because the friction between the water you're blowing through the straw, there's more friction associated with the longer straw. There's more contact between the water and the walls of the inside of the straw. And that means more force is required to move that water through there. Same thing with your blood vessels. Longer blood vessels, it takes more force to force the blood to, more pressure, more force to squeeze the blood through there. Blood vessel diameter, as we've already talked about, larger diameter decreases blood pressure. Smaller diameter increases blood pressure, increases peripheral resistance. Okay, now in general, in a healthy individual, normal adult, two of those factors usually remain pretty constant. You don't normally have major changes going on in your blood viscosity. You know, if you did develop polycythemia, or if you got a little bit dehydrated, your blood viscosity would go up, and then that would increase your peripheral resistance, and it would increase your blood pressure. Also, your blood vessel length generally doesn't change. Now, this does have a clinical application that I want to mention here, though. If you, let's say you put on some weight, which, hey, it's fall when I'm recording this, we're approaching the holidays. A lot of us tend to put on some weight during the holidays, and when you gain weight, the extra fatty tissue you put on, those fat cells, those adipocytes in those tissue require a blood supply, so you'll have blood vessels that lengthen to supply blood to those tissues. So that winds up increasing blood vessel length in the fatty tissues in your body, and guess what that does to your peripheral resistance? It goes up, and that increases your blood pressure. That's one of the reasons why if you gain weight, your blood pressure tends to go up, because your peripheral resistance increases in large part due to that increased blood vessel length. Okay, in terms of controlling blood pressure, you know, that's what we'll spend a lot of time in this chapter talking about. How does the body maintain its blood pressure? The key thing that the body can really control the most, now the body will try to control blood volume, you know, as we've already talked about with things like aldosterone and ADH, and we will review that again. But the other thing on a more short-term, a faster basis, is this peripheral resistance can be controlled by altering blood vessel diameter. So you constrict blood vessels, peripheral resistance goes up, blood pressure goes up. Blood vessels are dilated, pressure goes down, that peripheral resistance goes down, blood pressure goes down. So really the blood vessel diameter has the greatest influence on peripheral resistance, and your body controls that through that vasoconstriction, vasodilation type process. The blood vessels where this has the most influence are those arterioles, the smallest arteries that are leading to your capillary beds. That's where the majority of this control winds up taking place. All right, now you can have homeostatic imbalances, though, that also influence blood vessel diameter. And certainly the most common one is atherosclerosis. That is certainly a homeostatic imbalance you should be aware of, and that is where you have a buildup of fatty plaques that get deposited along the inside walls of arteries. And as they build up over time, it narrows the lumen, the open space in those arteries. That increases resistance to blood flow, as you can tell. That makes sense. That's going to jack up your blood pressure. So that's why, atherosclerosis, very common among Americans as we get older due to our diet that has a lot of the wrong types of fats and the wrong types of carbohydrates that get converted into fats. So we have lots of fats flowing through our blood vessels, and those get deposited in the walls and create these fatty substances we call plaque. So one of the reasons why it's not uncommon as we get older for our blood pressure to go up is because we have more of this atherosclerosis going on with the buildup of these materials along the inside linings of our arteries. This diagram is showing you, what gets that process started. The inside linings, the endothelium of your blood vessels, is supposed to be nice and smooth. However, if that's a very delicate tissue, so those get damaged from time to time, and when they do, that provides an opening into the underlying connective tissues and smooth muscle tissues in the walls of the artery, and that's where these fats first start getting deposited. And then over time, as more and more and more and more gets deposited there, it begins to extend out into the lumen of the artery and eventually can really block the blood flow. And then unfortunately, that can also lead to, you have this rough surface in here. If you guys remember, platelets tend to stick to rough surfaces more so than smooth surfaces, and that can start the coagulation process, and you can develop a blood clot that completely cuts off the flow of blood in that area. Okay, so the next couple of lectures we're going to be talking about, these are going to be a little bit more extensive. We're going to talk about short-term control of blood pressure and long-term control of blood pressure. And by short-term, what we're referring to are like instantaneous changes that occur in the body to help ensure that our blood pressure stays near a constant. Longer term refers to things that are not instantaneous, that are required to help us maintain our blood pressure within homeostatic ranges over a longer extended period of time. So that'll be the topic of our next two video lectures.